Welcome back to the Artie Lange Show from the SUMadison.com studios here in Lower Manhattan. My next guest, interesting guy, wrote an interesting book called The Beatle Who Vanished. There it is right there. And it's about a guy, not a lot of people knew this, I didn't, a guy named Jimmy Nicol filled in for Ringo Starr during the Beatles' first world tour in 1964 because Ringo was sick. And for 13 days, he was the Beatles drummer, and then he vanished. He basically disappeared. And this is a book about, the Beatles in general, but basically based on that story, which is a fascinating one. Here's Jim Berkenstadt. What's up, buddy?
Hey, nice to be on your show.
How
Thanks,
you doing?
Artie. Doing good.
Jim, so how do you get interested in a story like this? Like, how do you find out about it? And then, first of all, are you from New York? Where are you from?
No, I live in Madison, Wisconsin.
Is that where you're from?
I'm from Chicago.
And a huge music fan, Beatles fan
Music
to begin
fan,
with, or
Cubs fan, Blackhawks fan, Beatles fan.
so you had to get somebody good in there, the Beatles.
Yeah, I had to throw the Beatles in there. But I started as a Beatles fan.
You hear about
Ed
this
Sullivan.
story,
Right?
which was not. I like to consider myself a big fan of the Beatles and classic rock, and I don't really know much about this. Kind of heard about it. But what a fascinating story. How do you hear about it and then sort of get into it to where you want to write a book?
I was fascinated that there was always ever just this one sentence about Jimmy Nicol replacing Ringo Starr on their first ever world tour because Ringo got ill. And so I always wanted to know, well, what's this guy's backstory? Where did he come from? Why was he chosen?
What was wrong with Ringo, real quick, first, by the way?
Tonsillitis.
So he had to
go
go
in
quick
the hospital for
procedure
13
and then
days.
right back.
Actually, he didn't have the procedure at that time. They waited 6 months, but
He's probably scared to death. He
just
saw what
sat
happened
there.
with Pete Best. He took
Right.
over.
That's
Like, that's not
exactly
happening to me.
he felt very insecure while
Right.
in the hospital because he was seeing newsreels of Jimmy Nicol running around with the Beatles.
Right. So he's like, I'm not doing what I did to Pete Best. Here.
Right.
Yeah.
But I wanted to know who was this guy? Where did he come from? Why'd they pick him? Why was there such short notice? What was it like for an average guy, an everyman, to just suddenly be thrust into the biggest band in the world of all time
Craziness.
during the height of their fame? What would that be like for an average guy? I mean, one day no one even looks at you. The next day you come out of a limousine and they're tearing your clothes off. And they want a piece of you.
Yeah.
So I wanted to know about that. And then I thought, how does a young guy who was 25 at the time, he's a little older than the Beatles, how does he deal with that 15 minutes of fame the whole rest of his life? So how does he approach dealing with life after he's been to the top of the mountain and touched the sun?
It is fascinating.
So I thought, well, I'll try and write an article about it. There's not much out there. And then over the years, it took 6 years, I finally was able to track it down and found that although his 13 Days of Fame made headlines, that there was a real mystery here because this guy, his life was then riddled with blacklisting, betrayal, drugs, divorce, and then finally he disappeared seemingly forever, causing people to wonder whether he was dead or alive. So I had to dig into that.
Yeah, I mean, like any writer would, anybody who's interested in music would. I mean,
Is this guy an American? Is he?
No,
is
he was born in London. He's the only quote unquote Beatle born outside of the Liverpool area. He was born in London, and he grew up. They had some kind of similar Boy Scout thing there where he learned military drumming and such.
Right.
But then when he got old enough, he moved into the big city there in London and started working at a Boozy and Hawkes store repairing drums. And then he would hear, as a result, he'd hear where the gigs were happening or the jams. And he'd go to these little coffee clubs in Soho in London and just jam with people till finally he got offered a job with his first band, Colin Hicks and the Cabin Boys.
Okay. And then the Beatles sort of hear about him through that? Like when they need a drummer because Ringo's sick, how do they know about him?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think, actually, that Paul McCartney knew about him because at the time, Jimmy Nicol was playing for the hottest live band in London at the time called Georgie Fame and the Blue Flames. And McCartney was friends with Georgie and would go to these shows. And a lot of them would start at midnight and go till about 6 in the morning.
Right.
And so he saw Jimmy there. Also, a couple months before they needed him, or knew they needed him, Brian Epstein was in a studio where Jimmy Nicol was playing drums for a guy named Tommy Quickly, who was one of Epstein's proteges.
And Epstein was a legendary manager of the Beatles.
Right, who's being inducted into the Hall of Fame this week.
Another guy, yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. So he knew about him, and McCartney knew about him.
Right, but they actually didn't ask him first. Sort of a little-known thing. Again, I found that 2 other drummers were asked first ahead of Jimmy Nicol. And the first one, Ray Duval, was someone they had seen on one of the bills with the Beatles over the years on tour. He said, "No, I don't think the Beatles are going to amount to anything." So he lost his chance.
Wow.
And then the next guy, Bobby Graham, was a famous session player in London, and he said, "If I take 2 weeks off to travel with you guys, and I come back, the guy that calls the sessions isn't going to call me for a month, and I can't afford to lose the income." He said, "There's this guy, Jimmy Nicol. Call him."
Wow.
And the strange thing was Jimmy Nicol was really the best guy for the job because he knew all of Ringo Starr's drum parts for all those songs.
Wow, how was that?
Well, he had been in the studio a few months earlier, and some producer came in and asked a group of session players to learn the top hits of the day. Well, at the time, most of them were Beatles songs.
Yeah.
So he had to read. Someone had transcribed Ringo's drumming into musical notes, and Jimmy Nicol had to read it all, and he memorized all of the parts. So, I mean, talk about the stars lining up for this guy.
Everything happened for him.
Yeah.
So where did he tour with them on those 15 days?
They went to the Netherlands and played there on both TV and in concert. And then they came back to London. They flew backwards to London and then took another flight from London to Hong Kong, which had about 4 or 5 stops along the way.
Oh, wow.
And just to tell you how big the Beatles were then, no internet, no texting, none of this stuff. And they would land in some foreign country which doesn't even know the English language at 2 in the morning, and the airport would be surrounded with kids.
Right.
You know, how does that happen?
I know. Well, I mean, they were, insanely huge, I guess. You know, I mean, and he gets thrown into this. Now, does it change his life in a long-term way, in any way at all? I mean, in any form, does he see any success?
Sounds like it changed it negatively.
Well, I mean, it was a mixture. It was sort of a, this is like a cautionary tale. You know, there were some positive things that came from it. When he got back after the Beatles tour, Pi Records, where he had recorded a couple songs with his own solo group, instantly helped him put together a band. They went out on tour, but right away, Dave Clark of the Dave Clark Five got sick, and the Dave Clark Five had this like 3-week gig somewhere in England, like a summer resort place, and they slotted Jimmy Nicol's band in there and paid them what they would have paid Dave Clark Five. So that was a ton of money. Then they toured England there, and they toured around, and so he had some good times and bad. The Beatles went to Hong Kong with him. They went to Australia with him, and then Ringo flew back and met them in Melbourne, Australia. And there's a picture in the book, right here, the book, which shows all 5 Beatles on a balcony waving to the crowd. So it's like the only time you ever see 2 Beatles in a picture. And there were 5 2 drummers.
Literally, think about what you're talking about. You got Melbourne, Australia, Netherlands. I mean,
Sydney,
he really was
Hong
all over
Kong.
the place.
He was all over the place, and I think during the tour he started to feel like he was getting along so well with them socially. They were partying, and they were playing really well together. I think he started to get it in his head that maybe they might reject Ringo and let him keep going. It was an unrealistic thought.
When Ringo got back, animosity that Ringo had towards him that lasted a long time, or even a little bit?
No, Ringo wasn't upset with him at all, because mainly he got his, seat back right away. And
so there was no kind of insecurity that caused him to be angry towards him
only
at
while
all?
he was in the hospital, Ringo commented that he felt kind of funny seeing the boys go off with someone else. But once he got back, it's interesting because there's a famous press conference that shows all 5 of them again together, and you see instantly that the 4 of them have closed, the wagons around each other again now that Ringo's back, and they're sort of leaving Jimmy out in the cold, and even the TV camera that has all 5 sort of zooms in so you only see the 4 Beatles.
Really?
So, it was sort of the beginning and the end, and he realized it. The problem is he had a little trouble with Brian Epstein, who had flown over there with Ringo. And Jimmy had been able to go wherever he wanted on the tour at nighttime if he wanted to go out or something.
Yeah.
No one stopped him. But as soon as Epstein got there, it got very strict again. And so Epstein said, "Go pack your bag, and tomorrow we'll take you to the airport." And Jimmy just felt like he'd been rejected there. And so he snuck out of the hotel, went to a bar, and he was sitting there calmly drinking and having a cigarette.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, he heard these screeching tires pull up outside the bar, and 2 of the Beatles road managers came running in and said, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "Having a beer." and they said, "You can't be here. You have to get back into the hotel." And he said, "Why? I'm not a Beatle anymore."
Yeah.
And they said, "You are a Beatle until we put you on that plane."
Oh, God.
So,
I mean, so they were that sort of really
Well, it was just
corporate.
Epstein's rules were very
Yeah.
strict, and it was you must stay in the box. And Jimmy was a very independent guy. He didn't like all the boxes, hotels a box, backstage is a box, the limo's a box, and he just got tired of that.
Now, all the reports here about Pete Best was as soon as it was over, it was over. He never got any more contact with those guys ever again. Did Nickel ever talk
Not
to them?
true,
ever?
though.
Yeah, that's not true.
That's not true. Turns out that that actually Neil Aspinall, who was with the Beatles for years until he passed away, had a relationship with Pete Best's mom, and so they were in contact over the years. And in fact, when the Beatles put out their anthology release in the mid-'90s, Pete Best was financially rewarded for the songs that he recorded that they put on that album.
But I mean, as far as hanging out, like knowing them a little bit, having a relationship with them, I would,
that didn't happen.
Right.
Still.
But he was rewarded money, though.
Yeah, in the mid-'90s, Pete Best was, yeah.
And Jimmy Nickel, no.
Yeah, what's interesting is in 1984, Jimmy Nickel went with his son to a Beatle convention in Holland. And it went really well, and he liked it. And there's pictures of that in the book.
Yes.
And when he came back 10 years later, 94, this Holland Beatle Fest guy came to England and asked Howie, Jimmy's son, could Jimmy come back to Holland? Now it's the 30th anniversary of him touring with the Beatles. And he said, "No, I'm sorry, he's dead." And so, and McCartney asked Howie, "Hey, we'd like to have Jimmy Nickel be in our movie, the anthology, as during that part of it." And again, Howie said, "Nope, not going to happen." So, like, they created this sort of fake death, so Jimmy Jimmy could vanish.
No kidding.
And he involved his son, and his son, later got caught in kind of a lie there because he turned out to not be dead.
That really is crazy.
There's a lot of crazy stories in this book.
Why did he put his kid up to doing that?
I think that he felt that I guess what it is that he had sort of a love-hate relationship with having been in the Beatles.
And they wronged him, so he's not going to give them any.
I think he felt later. I later interviewed his second wife in Mexico City, and she said that he was upset and thought when his career went down the tubes after the Beatles that it was Brian Epstein's fault and that he had blacklisted him. I didn't find any evidence of that, but in his head, that's how he felt. So, but yet, whenever he wanted to attract people to a show or something, like in a club, he'd have the marquee say, "The Fifth Beatle, Jimmy Nickel, live in concert."
Right.
So it's kind of a love-hate thing.
Right.
Yeah. Well, that's a fascinating situation about how you hear that the Beatles, even the Rolling Stones, for as rock and roll as they try to seem, there's so many strict rules that Mick Jagger has, all this other stuff.
Yeah.
But Epstein and the Beatles, definitely a lot of stuff like that. It's a great book. You can stick around for a little bit, right?
Sure.
Yeah. Again, the book is The Beatle Who Vanished by Jim Berkenstadt, and it's about this little known guy, Jimmy Nickel, who definitely was a big part of the Beatles for at least a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
Right.
And then vanished. 1 second, let me try to find this commercial. I have to read. Welcome to radio. Fantasy baseball fans, on opening day, DraftKings.com is awarding over $500,000 in cash prizes. $500,000 day one. And there's way more to come. You got to check out DraftKings.com, America's favorite one-day fantasy sport. DraftKings is like watching your favorite sport over and over again. It's like sports fantasy. A guy named Sam won $100,000 his first time ever playing. Seriously, $100,000 to Sam, day one. It's easy. Just pick a team in minutes. Any sports fan can do this. Right now, you can play for free to win real cash. Enter Artie, A-R-T-I-E, today at DraftKings.com to get free entry into another huge contest. We're awarding over $400,000 in cash prizes. $400,000. Free spots are going quick, so enter Artie now at DraftKings.com. That's DraftKings.com. We'll be back with Jim Berkenstadt and the Beatle who vanished right after this.
The Artie Lange Show, weeknights on Audience, only on DirecTV.